Okay, good morning and good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar. I'm Chris Breeze, Vice Chairman of the British Omani Society. My background in Oman was as Shell Country Chair for the 6 years up to 2019. For those of you who haven't come across the Society before, we're a UK-based charitable organisation established in 1976 to preserve and enhance the long-standing friendship between Britain and Oman. We focus on a wide range of subjects, including youth, culture, business, and the environment. And we've got a crossover of several of those today. Our activities include events, webinars, grants and scholarships, connecting people across sectors and sharing success stories. His Majesty the Sultan is the Society's patron, and His Excellency the Omani Ambassador in London is our president. A shameless plug for membership. If you aren't already a member of the Society, it's really easy to join via our website, and the annual membership fee is only £25. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, there are a couple of housekeeping points I'd like to make. Firstly, the webinar will be recorded and made available online afterwards. Secondly, I hope we have time at the end for questions and answers. So if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box as we go along, and I'll aim to put the questions to Ammar at the end. Finally, I'd be grateful if you could keep your microphones muted unless Ammar or I ask you to speak. The webinar today is part of our series spotlighting emerging Omani talent and their contributions to Oman's Vision 2040. So it's with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Ammar Al-Balushi. Ammar is a research associate at Wood Mackenzie in the UK. He holds a BSc in mechanical engineering from Colorado State University, and he was part of the British Embassy Muscat Scholarship Programme and holds an MSc in Sustainable Energy Systems from the University of Edinburgh as a result. He will talk about the current hydrogen and ammonia markets, Oman's initiatives and the strengths and enablers in its industry frameworks. And so without further ado, can I open the floor to Ammar Al-Balushi? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chris, for the kind introduction, and hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to tune in today. Yes, Chris, as you mentioned, today we'll be diving into Oman's ambitions in the low-carbon hydrogen and ammonia space, with a particular focus on what's next for the upcoming sector. Now, as you all may know, Oman has set out some very ambitious targets by 2030. Many of these ambitious ambitions and targets and the subsequent progress came after 2022, and since then we've seen a lot of promise, a lot of potential come into play. But the challenges ahead, both globally and in Oman, is on realizing that potential and the progress so far into commercially viable projects with good returns to developers and a net benefit to Oman. So in today's presentation, we will discuss the state of the sector globally and regionally initially, and then we'll dive into the steps Oman has taken most recently to help spur final investment decisions and progress, as well as some of the steps that we reckon at Wood Mackenzie Oman could consider to realize its future targets. But before we dive into that, perhaps a round of introductions about myself, what I do and where I do it. Obviously, Chris introduced some of the things about me, but in general, yes, I'm a research associate at Wood Mackenzie. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, Wood Mackenzie is the leading global insights and analytics business for renewables, energy, and natural resources. We provide real-time analytics, consultancy, event, and thought leadership in the energy and natural resources industries. We generally cater to energy producers, governments, financial institutions, and utilities, advising and providing insights to their investments globally. Now, we're located in 30 locations around the world. I myself am based in Edinburgh here in the UK, and I am part of the hydrogen and ammonia research team. So we're a group of analysts that cover hydrogen and derivatives markets. I particularly focus on ammonia markets. So basically, I help support the build out of our ammonia supply and demand and price outlooks, as well as supporting our other pieces of analysis and consultancy in the industry. As Chris mentioned, my background is a mechanical engineer. I did my bachelor's in Colorado State University. I then spent some time in the utility sector in Oman before going on to do my master's here in Edinburgh. Again, my master's was supported by the British Omani Scholarship Scheme. This is a scheme set out by the British Embassy in Muscat, and it aims to support Omanis looking to complete their postgraduate degrees here in the UK. Now, if anyone in attendance has any questions about the scheme, please do feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to answer your questions and guide you through the process of applying. So without further ado, let's get into the presentation today. So before we dive into Oman, what I'd like to do is present a bird's eye view of the sector, of the hydrogen sector in general, with the hope that it can provide some color to the progress Oman has seen so far, but also add some flavor to the challenges it currently faces in growing out domestic low carbon hydrogen production. So if you look at how the industry has developed, obviously, as you can see in the chart, low carbon hydrogen began to make its waves at the start of the decade, so in 2020. We saw countries and economic blocs, prime example being the EU, rushing to announce supply and demand targets and coupling those targets with incentives and funding mechanisms to kickstart the industry. From the chart, we can see that from 2020 to 2023 in particular, we saw exponential growth in capacity announcements as developers began to originate projects and assess the suitability of low carbon hydrogen within their operations. However, as we moved into 2024, the industry began to shift. The announced pipeline peaked in terms of quarterly growth with a slowdown in announcements. Essentially, what began to happen is that industry participants, particularly the newcomers, began to realize the realities, risks, and challenges of building out a low-carbon hydrogen portfolio. And the participants who accepted the challenges and risks shifted their focus to developing their announced capacities rather than rolling out new announcements. So how does the pipeline look today? Well, we can say that the dust has begun to settle. And we can see that much of the pipeline remains in that announced or very early development phase, struggling to break into advanced development phases. What we do see is that the projects that have demonstrated the most commercial strength and viability, and as well as the ability to capture offtake, have moved forward into those advanced development stages and eventually to final investment decisions. It's also worth noting that the sector is also currently in a phase where many of the biggest and most influential players, which are mostly oil and gas majors, are under continuing pressure to de-risk their portfolios and revise capital allocations. Now, given the high risks associated with the majority of low carbon hydrogen projects, we do expect that the capacity in advanced development and ultimately in FID to remain but a very small percentage of the overall announced capacity, as we can see currently. It's also important to note that the hydrogen sector remains underpinned by strong incentives and policies globally. It still remains a policy-driven industry. We mentioned the EU. Now, the EU has set some very ambitious targets on the back of its third edition of the Renewable Energy Directive, also known as RED III. Now, this directive will eye around 20 million tons per annum of green hydrogen consumption by 2030. Now, while we at WoodMac believe this target is out of sight and will most likely not be achieved, what it will do and has begun to do is kickstart the industry and has already brought along a considerable amount of progress and development in projects within the EU and beyond. On the other hand, Northeast Asia has also been very active in spurring on the market. Japan recently wrapped up its first hydrogen contracts for difference round, which will provide up to $20 billion US dollars to export projects over 15 years, hoping to deliver low carbon hydrogen derivatives, mainly blue ammonia, into Japan. Similarly, South Korea has awarded the first round of a similar mechanism, although this was ring-fenced to the power industry. Now, those of us covering the South Korean market will know that the first round wasn't very successful. It only awarded 12% of the 6,500 gigawatt hours that it had tendered for. But what it did do is provide the initial discoveries, learnings, and experience, which will hopefully be carried on to the second round this year and further rounds in the years to come. However, it's not all bearish news. We also need to point to the positives. We now have 6 million tons per annum of low carbon hydrogen in post-FID capacity. Now, that's quite remarkable growth in what is a short space of time of about 4 years. The important context here is that this number actually equates to about 6% of carbon-intensive hydrogen production in operation today. In financial terms, 32 billion US dollars have been committed to post-FID low carbon hydrogen capacity to date. Now, if you remember in the initial slide where I showed, announced capacity, we saw quite big chunks of green capacity being announced and perhaps smaller capacities of blue being announced. However, when we look at post-FID capacity, what we do see is most of it is blue hydrogen, particularly blue ammonia. Now, this is something we expect, given that blue ammonia and blue hydrogen has the ability to offer earlier market scale, but there's also immediate offtake available for these products. What also jumps out is how concentrated this post-FID capacity is. As you can see, most of the green capacity is concentrated in China, while blue capacity is mainly concentrated in the US and Canada. And really, this has mostly been guided by how quickly these markets have been able to put policy and funding in place to support hydrogen production. In terms of where we've seen low carbon hydrogen being adopted so far, most of the post-FID capacity is centered on legacy end-use sectors. These are sectors where hydrogen in general has been a key feedstock, and the narrative behind projects going into these end-use sectors is to decarbonize existing hydrogen consumption rather than displace an incumbent fuel, for example, natural gas for heating. We are also seeing a large number of projects target export, but again, these projects will mostly be looking at ammonia as a hydrogen carrier. So again, feeding into a chemical that uses hydrogen as a feedstock. So we've taken the macro view. I think now it's time to focus down and take a regional view and look at the GCC. Now, some of you may know the GCC has been quick to ride the hydrogen wave, and we do expect it will continue to evolve into a key player in the industry and has already made its presence felt. Now, I won't go into all the details here, but what I want to highlight is the strength and versatility the region has managed to demonstrate so far, as well as the scale. GCC member states have pursued both blue and green hydrogen targets at various scales, but have achieved successes in both. And if we take Oman as an example of excellence, we can see that not only is there an FID in the form of the Acme Duqm Green Ammonia project, but we also have targets. We have a 1 million ton per annum green hydrogen target stretching to 1.5 by 2030. We have incentives in the form of 2 successful land auctions that offered land at discounted fees, so sort of a capex support, if you want to call it that. And then there's obviously, infrastructure support in the form of common infrastructure, as well as frameworks. And we'll revisit all these details later when we dive into Oman. But what I want to mention is that these 3 aspects have essentially launched the domestic industry and provided stable ground for future growth. And this is what we've seen around the GCC so far. Now, the GCC's progress shouldn't come as a surprise. The region is very well suited to capture the market given its existing strengths. While some markets entering the hydrogen space have historically not produced energy sources, and in many cases have been net importers of energy and will continue to do so, the GCC has decades of experience in setting up and designing policies related to energy production and export, which has allowed them to move into the hydrogen space quite quickly. When it comes to hydrogen in particular, member states have ensured that low carbon hydrogen is actually regarded as a pillar of growth, especially as economies in the region look for ways to diversify away from oil dependence, while, however, maintaining their leading positions in commodity markets. However, what's most important in my view is that the member states have maintained discipline when it comes to investing in low carbon hydrogen. Yes, we've seen ambitious targets, we've seen a lot of progress, but the financial commitment to realizing those targets has come through a phased approach, opting to match the growth of the market rather than build out and wait for the market to catch up. And lastly, and perhaps the most obvious strength from a technical perspective, the region is blessed with both the cheapest natural gas and renewable energy feedstocks, which have supported the growth in the industry. And when you're talking about an industry as in its nascency, like hydrogen, where price sensitivity is high, having access to cheap and accessible feedstocks is essential in supporting growth. So we finally get to Oman. As mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, Oman has been very active in the market so far. It has some of the most ambitious targets on a state level globally. Now, the rollout of these targets and the subsequent progress that we've seen since 2022 has been nothing more but a result of what is Oman's pioneering approach to support domestic hydrogen production. Oman essentially has hit the nail on its head when it comes to policy. The policy has been unique and inventive, but has also ensured to leverage Oman's strengths where necessary, but also minimize risks on the government as well. So a really balanced approach. Obviously, we all might know Hydrom. I think Hydrom is the jewel of the Omani approach. The use of an orchestrator has helped decouple hydrogen from other industries. Now, this is important as it's helped Oman convey the importance of hydrogen to international developers by giving hydrogen that special status. But it's also allowed Oman to develop the hydrogen ecosystem and develop it quickly. It's also important to note that Hydrom, yes, orchestrates, guides, dictates the industry, but it's not necessarily a developer. It doesn't invest significant capital in a specific project or set of projects. And this is unique where an entity can support the industry while maintaining an overall low risk profile. It's also worth mentioning that Oman has also done well in encouraging public and private partnerships. As mentioned, Oman intends to support the build out of common infrastructure, so everything from transmission cables, substations, eventually hydrogen pipelines, and desalination units to support projects that come online through its state-owned entities such as OQ, NAMA, SIAD, OETC, etc. Now, yes, unlike Hydrom, this will involve some investment and some capital allocation on the government's part or its entities. However, it's worth mentioning that this investment will only scale with the market and will only be as large as the projects that come online. And it's also considered quite a risk-averse approach in that regard. And lastly, credit is due for the overall ecosystem constructed by various ministries and entities in Oman, which has already put in place land and taxation policies specifically related to the hydrogen industry. And this is unique because we are seeing policy developments stagger globally, even in the most advanced markets, whereas Oman has managed to really establish policy quickly and quite early and has moved on to looking to advance its role in supporting the hydrogen industry. And it's also ensured that once the industry does come online, it will actually bring along a significant amount of localization and in-country value across the supply chain. So what has the approach produced so far in terms of tangible capacity development? Well, Oman, as you may know, has already conducted 2 land auctions, which were awarded in 2023 and 2024. Now, in total, these auctions have resulted in about 1.4 million tons per annum of green hydrogen capacity being announced. So if we remember, the targets we mentioned, 1 to 1.5 by 2030, in terms of announced capacity, Oman has already beat its base target. At the time, the land auctions were estimated to have unlocked $41 billion in foreign investment. We're going to be talking about rising costs in the industry, so that number may be re-estimated upwards since then. It's also worth noting that the projects have focused on the fertilizer and steel sector, so Oman doesn't just want to be a leader in the hydrogen production industry, but it also wants to be a leader downstream in green fertilizer and steel industries as well. In recent times, Oman had last week only just unveiled plans for a 3rd auction to be awarded next year. This auction will be a scale down from the previous 2 auctions. Again, not a surprise. Oman's already beaten its base target, now eyes its stretch target. So we expect about 0.15 to 0.2 million tons per annum to be targeted. We do expect ammonia will remain a focus of the projects awarded given their export nature, but we might also see some new sectors such as e-fuels emerge as well. So, Oman's done a lot on the supply side to get projects off the ground, to support production. So Oman's now also, and specifically Hydrom, is looking at how it can extend its role to support the demand side, which is probably the more complicated part of the equation. So what Hydrom is looking into is a domestic contracts for difference mechanism. So essentially this mechanism is looking to decarbonize hard to abate industries in Oman, such as the fertilizer or steel sectors, as well as offer competitive offtake to developers. Now, I understand the term contracts for difference, or CFD, is used in many contexts, so allow me to step you through how it would work in the context of hydrogen. So we have a producer that produces green hydrogen or a derivative, say ammonia, and it wants to sell that green hydrogen at a price called the strike price. Usually this price is a cost of production plus a margin that guarantees its cost of capital. Now it will sell its strike price to the aggregator, which in this case would be Hydrom or another Omani entity. And usually if you have a group of production assets, you would have them join an auction. They would all submit their strike price and you would award the lowest strike prices with contracts. So the aggregator would then take that hydrogen or derivative at the strike price and go to market and sell it at a discounted price, which is usually just about the conventional or the incumbent fuel price in the market. Again, this might be difficult to comprehend. So what I've done is I've on the right added a case study of how this would work for a hypothetical Omani fertilizer company and a hypothetical green ammonia project in Oman. So if we start from the bottom in the gray bar, we're using our conventional ammonia price models. We estimate that currently gray ammonia, conventional ammonia, carbon intensive ammonia, however you want to frame it, is priced in Oman about $200 to $300 per ton. So this is the ammonia that the fertilizer company currently is taking in to make fertilizers. If you look at the top at the green bar, using our green LCOA models, we estimate that Omani projects, green ammonia projects, come in at $800 to $1,000 per ton, depending on how the project selects its equipment, as well as how it optimizes its feedstock. So if you were the aggregator in this case, some form of Omani government entity, and you wanted to buy green ammonia and sell it to the market, you would probably have to cover a cost gap of $600 and $800 per ton. So that's the price that you would have to bear as the aggregator. So you're probably wondering, as an aggregator, why would I want to do this? Obviously, there isn't a net profit here. You're actually taking a loss. And you're right. However, there are some benefits. The main one, of course, is that investors, in this case producers, are guaranteed an attractive return on their projects through the strike price. If they can guarantee their cost of capital on the project, they will take a final investment decision and they will commission. The hope is that once projects begin to operate and move up the learning curve, they will gain efficiencies and we will start to see reductions in production costs. In simplistic terms, we will see that green bar get closer to the gray bar. The inherent risk, of course, is that that does not happen. We could see that production costs stay at where they are, or we don't see enough reductions. There's also a risk of a lack of increase in willingness to pay, so we don't see that gray bar go up. It's important to note that willingness to pay usually stems from one or more of three things. Either you have subsidies in place to incentivize decarbonization, you have rising carbon costs, or you have rising conventional fuel costs, either rising natural gas costs, etc. It's worth noting that currently, and perhaps in the near future, Oman doesn't have any of those three. We are yet to have subsidies to incentivize decarbonization. We do not have carbon costs, and we are still blessed with cheap natural gas costs. So the hope in Oman's case is really that that green bar starts to come down. Now, it's worth noting that this mechanism isn't groundbreaking. It's been applied for many years now across various energy industries. It was instrumental in the rise of the wind industry here in the UK, especially in the early days, about 15 years ago. But it's also been applied in the hydrogen space successfully as well so far. We've seen it again here in the UK through the first two hydrogen allocation rounds. We've seen it through the German CCFD mechanism. We've seen it on a global scale with the German government as well. And Japan and South Korea are also using this mechanism, as I mentioned at the start. I also want to mention, again, Oman hasn't gone ahead with this scheme yet. It's still under consideration. And, Hydro might decide that it does not want to go ahead with the scheme. It's only exploring it at the current stage. But we felt it would be good to highlight how it works. So as mentioned at the start, there are challenges, both globally and on a domestic scale. And much of these challenges lie within how do we transform the progress, the announcements, the pre-FID developments that we've seen so far, which there are many, into commercially viable projects. How do we get projects off the ground from the meeting rooms to the construction zones? And these are challenges that are global, as I said, and Oman is no exception. These challenges exist in Oman as well. So as mentioned, Oman has attracted developers who've announced a significant amount of capacity. However, it's worth noting that much of this capacity remains in an announced phase, with only 3% taking FID. Again, it's worth noting that the headwinds that the Omani industry is experiencing are global headwinds. Green projects globally have been hit with rising costs. The price discoveries have shown that green hydrogen is associated with a high premium, and as a result, demand for this green product has failed to materialize. Off-takers are not willing to pay the green premium associated with green hydrogen. Hence, there isn't an Omani issue here per se. It's a global one that we're seeing green hydrogen developers across the globe facing. Now, Oman could have an issue with its reliance on green hydrogen to achieve its low carbon hydrogen targets, because if we look at the trends globally, we've seen quite lethargic growth in green post-FID capacity, as I mentioned, where blue hydrogen seems to be taking the lead. However, it's also worth noting that Oman's done pretty much all it can on the supply side, and that's reflected in the large amount of announced capacity we've seen. And Oman's done a lot to help these projects develop all the way to post-FID, but the issue really is on the demand side. So we don't just want to talk qualitatively about the issues, we also want to quantify them. So over here, we can see that we track about 1.95 million tons per annum of announcements in the hydrogen space in Oman. We estimate 1.3 MTPA remains in the announced phase. 0.4 MTPA is in some sort of development ranging from post-feasibility pre-feed to advanced pre-feed, so quite early development. And only 0.1 MTPA is in post-FID, and that is the Acme Duqm Green Ammonia project that I mentioned earlier. We also want to note that we do have some blue capacity in development. That's in the form of the Blue Horizon project being developed jointly by OQ and Shell. However, we also want to mention that Oman currently does not include blue hydrogen in its hydrogen targets and only considers green hydrogen. Again, these targets are comprised of a base target of 1 MTPA by 2030, stretching to 1.5 MTPA. So bearing that in mind, if we are to see these targets realized as things stand, we will need to see at least 0.9 MTPA take FID. Our data indicates that projects require approximately 3 to 4 years to complete construction costs. So this is based off projects that have taken FID globally and are under construction. So if Oman is to produce 1 MTPA at least of green hydrogen by 2030, not only does 0.9 MTPA need to take FID, it needs to take FID in the next 2 years. Now, this is a considerable amount of capacity that needs to take FID fairly quickly. It's about 15% of the current post-FID capacity. Now, again, Oman wanting to be the leader that it is, perhaps that number doesn't phase the Omani strategy as much, but it is a lot of capacity that needs to take FID quite quickly. And once again, Oman has established the correct ecosystem for these projects to take FID, but it will also hinge on the emergence of global demand, which is what's really putting these targets at risk right now. So while the challenges are large, there do remain pathways for Oman to further bolster its chances to meet its ambitious targets. And this is really stemming from the foundations Oman has put in place through its strategy, through its policy, through its frameworks. And this has really given some room for Oman to tweak, its land auctions, its incentives to help accelerate FIDs. And that's what we've seen in the most recent land auction. However, as I mentioned earlier, we at WoodMac also believe there are a couple more potential steps and mechanisms that Oman or Hydrom could consider as well to help unrisk those 2030 targets. So of course, before I go into that, I do want to highlight that, Hydrom has adopted changes in its recent land auction. to help accelerate final investment decisions, FIDs. The first change being the change in project sizing, as the newly launched auction will look towards small to mid-scale projects that have, and Hydrum's overall tendered for a smaller capacity and land size than the previous auctions. Again, no surprise, since Oman's already announced a significant amount of capacity, but this still remains a welcome step, as so far projects that have scaled down to the size of demand available have been the most successful. And one could argue that the projects awarded in the first two auctions were quite large and had more of a long-term view, while as the projects looking to bid into this auction might be more suited for the immediate market available. The second change is aimed at maximizing project revenue, and this is done by allowing developers to sell excess electricity on the Omani spot market. As you may know, Oman has recently launched a spot market. I think it's still in its pilot phase, but it's looking to scale from there. So not only is this a good step for the Omani electricity sector in general, as it injects liquidity into the spot market, but it also allows projects to increase their economics through multiple revenue streams. So not just only selling hydrogen, but also making money when demand for hydrogen is low, but they still have renewable energy online. And the better the economics, the closer projects will be to FID, the more bankable they will be, and we should expect that projects prospects of reaching FID to increase as a result of this tweak in policy. Thirdly is the offtake platform, which will match developers and off-takers. Again, this might be preempting a CFD mechanism and might be the initial steps towards that. However, nevertheless, it's a welcome step, even if it's initial, as it will streamline the contracting process between developers and off-takers. And lastly, we have the extended bid timeline. Now, this will allow developers more time to test the feasibility of their projects and establish their technical and commercial parameters pre-award, which will shorten the bankability period post-award. And this was, one of the issues of the first two land auctions is the bankability period we've seen from the initial announcement of awards till expected FIDs. However, as mentioned, we do believe there are some further steps that could be taken to help reach the 2030 targets. One of which is related to blue ammonia, which we see as a lucrative near-term solution in ramping up Oman's post-FID capacity. In general, blue ammonia demand is set to rise exponentially in the coming years and early into 2030s. We estimate about 11 MTPA of blue ammonia demand by 2031. And there are essentially two reasons for this. On the European side, we're seeing rising carbon costs through the phase out of free emissions allowances, and also the phase in of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And this has been driving fertilizer, chemical, and metals and mining companies to adopting cheap, low carbon imports of blue ammonia over domestic conventional ammonia production, which is expected to rise in costs in the coming years, but especially in the periods between 2030 and 2035. However, as mentioned, the real driver, or maybe the bigger driver, is from Northeast Asia, particularly in South Korea and Japan, where blue ammonia is seen as a decarbonization tool for the power sector, which currently relies on coal mainly. And essentially, South Korea and Japan are looking to co-fire blue ammonia with coal to help reduce emissions in the power sector. So given the rise in demand expected, the market has reacted, and we've seen significant post-FID capacity. Most of it has come from Canada, the US, but also the GCC. In fact, 40% of this capacity has come from the GCC, as the region alongside the US Gulf Coast is expected to dominate the export market. We've seen FIDs in the UAE through Project Rubdan. We've seen FIDs in Qatar through CAFCO 7. However, we do expect to see further expansions before 2030. As mentioned, Oman has played a role in the blue ammonia market, albeit not the post-FID market, but the market's in development through its Blue Horizons project, which is in pre-feed. From a commercial perspective, we believe this project, as well as blue ammonia generally in Oman, has many upsides. And absorbing blue ammonia as a target into the overall low carbon hydrogen targets would mitigate the risks of not achieving said targets by instead of relying only on green hydrogen, which is currently mostly at risk around the world, and instead relying on blue hydrogen, which is seeing a lot more offtake available. We also want to note that the current blue ammonia market really aligns strongly with the way Oman has done business historically, but also its future ambitions and constraints. The market is set to offer a large amount of demand at attractive premiums, which will obviously feed into commercially robust projects able to capture premiums through the offtake, and that will result in a lot of post-FID capacity. And as mentioned, that's what we're seeing already in the market. But what's interesting is most of the post-FID capacity that we're seeing, whether it be in the GCC or in the US Gulf Coast, involves a Northeast Asian offtake equity partner. So this usually involves a Japanese or South Korean equity partner that also not only farms into the project through equity, but also offtakes the produce from the project, further de-risking the project. Now, this may sound familiar to some of you because in Oman, these synergies have been around for years, and perhaps the best example I can give is the gas market. So what we're saying is that, the policies, relationships, and frameworks to foster these partnerships into the blue ammonia industry in Oman already exist and can be capitalized on. So an early win there. From a technical perspective, the early adoption of CCUS will also bring along long-term benefits, as learnings from the project, which would be an early mover in the carbon capture and utilization space, can be transferred into other carbon-intensive industries in Oman, which in the future will need to adopt some form of carbon capture as well. And lastly, one of the topics that always comes up when discussing blue ammonia is Oman's long-term gas resource, which is always a topic of debate. Is Oman's long-term outlook a deficit, a surplus? It really depends on the markets as well as the utilization projects in development at the time. But what we want to highlight is blue ammonia actually utilizes a relatively moderate amount of gas resource compared to other utilization pathways, whilst also offering attractive premiums and in some instances comparable returns as well. Lastly, we want to shift focus back to the domestic CFD auctions that Hydrom are exploring. Exploring domestic implementation will definitely provide a good proof of concept. We're sure there are many learnings there, and it's definitely a step in the right direction. However, the real upside lies with global implementation and Hydrom expanding its envisaged role as an aggregator to global demand rather than just domestic demand. Now, the main benefit would be the availability of larger amounts of offtake to sell Omani volumes into. We mentioned the EU, for example, who's looking to take in 20 MTPA of green hydrogen. And what this will do is help projects realize their full capacities, even the projects announced in the first two auctions, where we mentioned that perhaps they were quite large. These projects will have better chances of realizing their full capacities, and that will result in Oman reaching its targets that's put out. But what's interesting is from a commercial standpoint, in the long term, this mechanism is sustainable. Obviously, we showed in the initial slide that, applying it domestically, you're looking at a $600 to $800 per ton hit. Whereas in the long term, global implementation using our ammonia price models for Omani FOB green ammonia and delivered carbon intensive ammonia into Europe, we find that Omani green ammonia with time is expected to become cheaper. Again, that's owing to carbon costs. And the aggregator, in this case, an Omani entity, Hydrom, whoever, would actually be in the money in the long term if it manages to, lock in a long-term contract with the producer at a given strike price. Implementation of a global CFD would also enhance the involvement of Omani state-owned entities, especially in the logistics sector, which Oman is already looking to build out. And what it will do is help these state-owned entities develop experience in exporting hydrogen and derivatives into markets like Europe. Again, we're not suggesting anything groundbreaking here. We've already seen the implementation of a global CFD, albeit from the demand side from Germany's Hintco, which awarded its first H2 Global contract to an Egyptian project. So it will buy Egyptian green ammonia at about $1,000 per ton and then resell it into Europe at around the conventional cost price with the hope of making a profit with time. But even though it's from the demand side, the mechanism remains the same. And we've already seen success there. And we do believe if Oman is looking to implement a CFD mechanism, it is really well suited to mimic this mechanism that Germany has done, but albeit from the supply side. So to wrap it all up, I just want to mention again, Oman's already done incredible progress. The fact that it's managed to attract so much investment while taking on so little risk is quite outstanding. But not only that, it's pioneered how to develop a hydrogen sector. And we've already seen other markets sort of use the Omani experience to build out their own hydrogen sectors. And this has been translated, as I mentioned, the first two land auctions, which have been very successful at attracting foreign investment. And Oman's already announced enough capacity to beat its 2030 targets. However, as mentioned, the key challenge is transforming that announced capacity into commercially viable projects that break ground. Oman's already wary of these challenges, especially the time constraints and the essence of time in these challenges, has already included some changes and some policy tweaks in its recent auction. However, we do still believe that there are a couple of steps that Oman could explore that would bring it closer to their targets. We talked about blue ammonia and the early wins there for Oman and how Oman can capitalize on its strengths there and join the GCC in leading the market. And we also talked about extending the CFD mechanism that's currently under discussion to perhaps look at global demand to offer more offtake to developers and ensure this mechanism is sustainable in the long term. So that's it from me. We're going to have a Q&A session now, but before I get into that, just two more things. We do have an annual hydrogen conference with Mackenzie's Hydrogen Conference. It runs here in the UK in London. So if yourself or your entity are interested in joining us, please do register or reach out with any questions. We'd love to have you later on this year. In a couple of weeks' time, we are going to be at the World Hydrogen Summit. So again, if you or your entity are attending, please do reach out if you want to have a chat or swing by our stand. We'd love to talk to you. So yeah, that's it. If we have any questions, now's the time to address them.
Great, Amar. Thank you very much indeed for a really clear and an insightful talk on the subject. I've got a bunch of questions, but let's go to the Q&A box. And I notice we have a couple of questions from Yusuf Al-Badi. If you want to come off the microphone, come on the mic, Yusuf, and ask your questions. And if not, I'll ask them myself. Yusuf? No. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and ask them. First question is, do you believe hydrogen is a reliable and realistic choice for decarbonizing the aviation sector, specifically for use in aircraft? What are your thoughts on its viability compared to other alternatives like SAF? I don't know what the S stands for, but presumably AF is aviation fuel, synthetic aviation fuel. Any thoughts on that, Amar?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the aviation sector, the main competition is between hydrogen and SAF, as you mentioned, but also biofuels. In the long term, hydrogen is a good tool for that. Obviously, when you're talking about other biofuels, you also have to look at the feedstock elements in creating those biofuels in terms of carbon capture, etc. Whereas hydrogen can be a bit more sustainable. Obviously, there's the issue of costs. That's why we're seeing a lot of mechanisms in place, particularly Refuel EU Aviation, put in place to help bridge the costs between conventional e-kerosene or jet fuel and hydrogen-based jet fuel. However, we have the view that the current implementation in place isn't enough to bridge those costs, at least in the near term. And with the current policies, we do expect that hydrogen will become more viable in the long term, perhaps post 2040.
Okay. Thanks very much. Yusuf's second question, I think, was answered by the rest of your talk. He asked it quite early on, and I think the rest of your talk answered that. The third question is, what is the expected impact of USA tariffs on ammonia prices?
Yeah, that's a good question. If we're talking long term, and if you're talking blue ammonia, I think let's address the green ammonia question first. So US green ammonia was already challenged as it is. It really hinged on the emergence of the finalization of the 45V tax credit. Obviously, that finalization took a bit too long to come through. It came through at the end of 2024, and the clarity that it brought was ultimately offset by the Trump 2.0 administration, which really sent the most aspects of the IRA into frenzy and unclarity, let's say. So tariffs really don't have an impact there because the industry was changed as it is, the industry was stalled as it is. Where things get interesting is blue ammonia. Blue ammonia, we've seen considerable progress in the US. A lot of projects have broken ground or have just taken FID. We saw a very high profile FID just a couple of weeks ago. And what's interesting is where these projects are going to be sourcing their kit from. We've had some developers come out and say that almost 50% of their equipment is exposed to tariffs. We've had other developers say that they're not so exposed. So it's going to be interesting in looking at those dynamics. And the main risk there is that US blue ammonia becomes a bit more expensive than originally thought. And one of the main things that's pushed blue ammonia forward so far is how cheap it is comparable to green ammonia. So that's on the blue ammonia. Obviously, if you want to talk conventional ammonia, the US is currently an importer of ammonia, particularly from two places, Trinidad and Tobago and Canada. And these were, Canada in particular was hit by some substantial tariffs. However, we haven't yet to see any material impact on pricing so far, and it's mostly been absorbed in the market.
Great, thank you. Another question, this from Shaqiq Al-Musafir. Since this policy supports green ammonia, how will NOx, I guess, what's that, nitrous oxide? I don't know. Emissions be managed if ammonia is used as fuel?
Yeah, so the IMO is currently in process of setting out the regulations towards NOx. I believe, the final draft of regulations was finalized last year. In October, I believe they're going to be voting on those regulations. I haven't read up on them in a while, so I can't really talk to the specifics. But what I can say is it is a concern in the industry. It's really what's impeded perhaps the progress towards ammonia-fueled maritime engines so far, although we are seeing some progress, and much of that is on the back of the regulations that are set to come in play later this year.
Okay, and a question which I think you probably covered, but I can't recall the answer, so I'll ask it again. What is the cost comparison between green and blue hydrogen? You showed grey and green hydrogen, but what's the cost comparison between green and blue?
Yeah, so in Oman's case, blue hydrogen comes at around, I'd say, $550 to $650 per ton, compared to $800 to $1,000 per ton for green ammonia. So quite a substantial difference in that regard. Again, it really depends on where you're sourcing your gas from. That's the ultimate driver of costs, and that's why we've seen the US Gulf Coast, a bit of Canada, and the GCC really lead in that market.
Right. And how do you compare Oman's approach to developing a hydrogen and ammonia sector compared to the rest of the GCC?
Yeah. I think the main point is the risk taken. What we've seen in the GCC is the involvement of NOCs, national oil companies, in developing projects solely or taking large stakes in projects. Now, that's not to say that that approach is wrong. It has its benefits, but if we're talking purely from a risk point of view, Oman has not taken such risks. I think the most an Omani entity has in a project, I think it's OQ, is about 25% per project. With the exception of the blue ammonia project, where OQ has 50%, but again, the blue ammonia project has less risked. So that's understandable. So Oman really hasn't committed that much capital in terms of when we compare to the GCC. Now, this is good in terms of risk. On the other hand, you have the other side of the equation is that we've seen more FID capacity in neighboring countries. And perhaps that's because NOCs tend to have a lower cost of capital requirement. They have the ability to inject cash into the market. They have the ability to leverage their experience in exporting. So they can move projects along quicker, whereas relying on foreign and private investment, these are companies that, in many cases are very risk averse. They want to ensure project commerciality before going ahead with projects. They might be a bit slower to develop as a regard. So again, there's benefits, there's pros and cons in each approach, but the main difference really is how much risk the Omani government has taken in comparison to its neighboring governments.
Yeah. Interesting question. I suspect I know the answer. Does someone make a profit with hydrogen in Oman today?
Technically, yes. Hydrogen is a main feedstock in refineries and ammonia production. Oman is an ammonia producer, and methanol production. Oman is a methanol producer. So in terms of gray hydrogen, yes. Green hydrogen, we obviously don't have any projects yet, so no.
Yeah. Okay. Something from James Marriott. Hi, Amar. Thank you for a very interesting and informative presentation. Is there a rough calculation for how much a CFD mechanism would cost the government, either on the domestic scale only or the wider global scale as well?
Yes, I think the example I flashed up was, in today's terms, at least how much it would cost is $600 to $800 per ton, and you would really apply that on how much ammonia or derivative you're looking to supply into the domestic market, and that really hinges on what Oman or Hydrom is mandated to decarbonize. So you would back calculate from there. Obviously, those numbers haven't been released, but generally it's $600 to $800 per ton in terms of ammonia. On a global scale, if we're looking at the EU, conventional ammonia prices sit between $500 to $650 per ton. On a given day, it swings. So again, the cost gap there is probably reduced to about $300 to $400 per ton. So hopefully, again, you'd have to really multiply that into how much produce you're looking to export into that market, which is all very speculative, but from a pure price per unit point of view, those are the prices we're looking at.
Great, thank you. A question from Yahya Al-Fouri. Since the bid timeline is extended to 9 months, will there be any checkpoints or milestones during that period to keep developers aligned?
Yeah, I think there's an RFQ submission criteria timeline, and obviously, Hydrom is always in touch with developers. So perhaps that's a question for Hydrom and the business development team there, but they always reinforce the fact that they're well connected with developers, either bidding or developing projects in Oman. So I imagine so, yes.
Great. And a question: how do you forecast UAE and other GCC countries other than Oman in the race of green energy or clean energy project developments?
I can't really speak to perhaps the solar or other green developments, but if we're talking purely from hydrogen and ammonia, I think the UAE is one of the countries that's put out targets in terms of green, as well as Oman. But what we haven't seen the same amount of announcements that we've seen in Oman. Again, we are well aware that there are some unannounced projects that are being developed in the background and usually only surface once they've gone out of that pre-development or early development period and they're ready to take a final investment decision. Obviously, the UAE's already gone ahead with the Blue project. ADNOC took an acquisition of Fertiglobe, which has really positioned them well to really burst onto the scene in the ammonia market and be a leader in that space. In Saudi, obviously, we have the NEOM project. I think that project doesn't need any introductions. It's the largest green ammonia project in development today. That's set to come online in 2028. And that was really a milestone for the industry in general for that project to take a final investment decision. And it's good to see how far along it's come since then in terms of construction. But where Saudi really is looking to push into now is blue ammonia. Saudi Aramco recently announced some really big targets. It's probably going to be one of the biggest market leaders in that regard. Similarly, in Qatar, obviously Qatar is one of the largest ammonia exporters currently, so no surprise that alongside its very cheap gas resources, it's looking to leverage its strengths and become a blue ammonia leader as well. So it's really different strategies, but all in the goal of decarbonizing hydrogen and ammonia production in general, I'd say.
Thank you. And a question from our chairman, Richard Stanford. It is very good to see you again, and it's good to see you thriving. Thanks for an excellent summary of where Oman is positioned on the global stage. My question is about ammonia and how effective it really is as a method of transporting H2, given the significant loss of energy converting both ways.
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, if you're transporting ammonia for the purpose of reconverting it back into hydrogen, you're going to need to crack it. Estimates show that you're going to lose 20 to 25% in the cracking process alone. You are going to, also, if you're not utilizing the boil-off fuel when you're transporting it, you're going to lose some ammonia there as well. So overall, yes, it's not the ideal scenario. But what I will say is, when you look at the other alternatives, it does weigh up well. Liquefaction, obviously, is a big topic in Oman. We do still think that liquefaction is quite expensive, but overcoming the costs there could really unlock it as a potential carrier source, but that remains to be seen. Other methods, such as liquid organic hydrogen carriers or gaseous hydrogen itself, could be also, have their constraints. Methanol is one that's coming into play as well, but the reconversion from methanol to hydrogen is still also in its early stages. So I think ammonia still stands as the best choice if you're looking to transport hydrogen, especially through a seaborne route.
Thank you. A question about studies. From Saeed Al-Sibani. I'm currently pursuing a master's degree in operations and supply chain management. Do you have any recommendations on areas to focus on in my research that are related to hydrogen? And what is missing so far?
Oh, that's a good question. I think really looking at infrastructure is a key point, especially if you're looking at supply chain management. we have a lot of projects announced, and much of the focus now is how to develop the supply chain and optimize it. Obviously, Richard alluded to, ammonia as a carrier and the losses there. So I'd say really tackling that issue and really understanding how different options of managing the supply chain of transporting hydrogen over long distances, especially if looking at it from a Romanian perspective, where you're looking to export, I think that really is where the main challenge is. And if you were to look to focus on something within your field, I'd say that would be it.
Great, thanks. There are actually a bunch of other questions which I haven't got round to, but we're rapidly running out of time. So I just wanted to say thank you very much indeed for an excellent summary of where Oman is on this subject. I can also see why WoodMac is so enduring as providing a real key insight into a range of energy subjects and other industries. You've done a fantastic job. Thank you very much indeed, and the best of luck. Best of luck going forward, both with WoodMac and in further projects. Thank you very much indeed, and thanks to all the attendees for coming. And I hope you found it as useful as I did.